Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. Growing up in Cedar Heights always felt like drowning in concrete and noise. The city pressed against me from every direction. Honking cars, screaming sirens, neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls at 3 in the morning. I wasn't antisocial, but crowds made my chest tighten and my palms sweat. The constant din of urban life scraped against my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. My younger brother Gabriel was my complete opposite. At 12 years old, he thrived on attention and chaos. He collected friends like trading cards, always surrounded by laughter and energy. His latest obsession consumed him entirely: filmmaking. The 6th grade movie project had transformed him into a miniature director, complete with a second-hand camcorder he'd begged our parents to buy. When Mom and Dad announced we'd visit our cousins in Millwood so Gabriel could film his project, I felt my shoulders drop with relief. Millwood was everything Cedar Heights wasn't: small, quiet, tucked away in the foothills near Angeles National Forest. Our cousins Benedict and Blake lived there with their parents on 7 wooded acres, far from traffic lights and apartment buildings. The twins matched Gabriel's boundless energy, but their chaos felt contained by the thick pine trees and soft earth. As we pulled into their gravel driveway, I watched Gabriel clutch his camcorder like it held the secrets of Hollywood. Before our car even stopped, he burst out calling for the twins, his voice echoing off the surrounding trees. "I need a cameraman," Gabriel announced, staring at me with those wide eyes that always got him what he wanted. "You're better with cameras than anyone I know." I'd planned to spend the weekend inside, reading and avoiding the inevitable noise of 3 hyperactive kids. But something in his voice, a desperation beneath the excitement, made me nod reluctantly. Within minutes, I found myself trudging behind them through towering pines, half-heartedly filming their elaborate fantasy adventure. Gabriel had transformed the twins into medieval heroes with cheap costume cloaks and plastic swords from the dollar store. They ran between trees, shouting scripted dialogue and improvising ridiculous plot twists. Benedict wielded his sword dramatically while Blake perfected his villain laugh, voice cracking as he tried to sound menacing. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more my unease grew. Shadows stretched longer here, creating pockets of darkness even in midday sunlight. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly. My breathing quickened as I struggled to keep the camera steady, hands trembling slightly. "Guys, let's take a break," I called out, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "I need some water." Gabriel sighed dramatically, pretending to collapse against a tree trunk. "You can't keep up with real filmmakers," he teased, but his smile seemed forced. Back in the house, the silence felt like a warm embrace. My heart rate slowed as I opened the refrigerator, reaching for a pitcher of iced tea. The cold glass felt solid and real in my hands, grounding me after the strange anxiety in the woods. Then it happened. A scream tore through the afternoon air. Not the playful shouts I'd grown accustomed to, but something raw and terrified that turned my blood to ice water. The pitcher slipped from my hands, shattering against the kitchen floor in an explosion of glass and tea. "Gabriel!" My voice cracked as I sprinted toward the back door. The clearing where they'd been filming just minutes earlier stood completely empty. The plastic swords lay scattered in the dirt, the costume cloaks fluttering eerily in the breeze like abandoned skin. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, just emptiness that felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. "Gabriel! Benedict! Blake!" My shouts echoed back from the trees, mocking and hollow. I ran from tree to tree, spinning in circles, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. The woods seemed to swallow my voice, giving nothing back but silence. Within 20 minutes, both sets of parents had joined my frantic search. We crashed through underbrush, calling their names until our throats burned. The police arrived as dusk settled over Millwood, their flashlights cutting through gathering shadows like weak prayers. Search and rescue teams worked through the night, methodically combing every inch of the 7-acre property and beyond. Bloodhounds arrived at dawn, their handlers grim-faced and professional. Volunteers from town appeared with thermoses of coffee and determined expressions. Hours blended into days. The search expanded to cover hundreds of acres, helicopters circling overhead while ground teams pushed deeper into the national forest. I barely slept, barely ate, spending every waking moment listening to radio chatter and watching the command post they'd set up in our cousin's driveway. The waiting was agony. Every ring of a phone, every hushed conversation between officers, every time a search team returned empty-handed felt like another small death. I found myself staring at the tree line, convinced I could will them to emerge from the shadows if I just looked hard enough. On the 4th day, my mother found me sitting on the porch at 3 a.m, still staring into the darkness. "Come inside," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "You need to rest." But rest felt impossible when my little brother was somewhere out there in those woods. 2 weeks and 3 days after the disappearance, the call came. A park ranger had found them in Whitewater Canyon, 18 miles northeast of Millwood. The sheriff's voice on the phone was carefully controlled, clinical in a way that made my stomach clench. Benedict and Blake were dead, their bodies showing signs of severe trauma. Gabriel had been found suspended from a tree branch over a rocky creek bed, still wearing the costume cloak from his movie. The sheriff wouldn't provide details over the phone, but his hesitation spoke volumes. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and whispered condolences. Nothing felt real, not the flowers, not the casseroles neighbors brought, not the way adults spoke in hushed tones when they thought I wasn't listening. I moved through those days like I was underwater, everything muffled and distant. 3 days after the funeral, Detective Morrison came to our house. He handed me a plastic evidence bag containing Gabriel's camcorder, his expression unreadable. "We've reviewed the footage," he said quietly. "There's content on here that might help you understand what happened. But I want you to know that some things, once seen, can't be unseen." That night, I sat in my room staring at the small device. My hands shook as I removed it from the evidence bag and powered it on. I had to know. I owed Gabriel that much. The video began innocently enough. Gabriel's excited voice directing the twins through their scenes, all 3 boys laughing as they charged through the trees with plastic swords. I recognized every location. The fallen log they'd used as a castle wall. The cluster of boulders that became their throne room. Then the footage changed abruptly. The audio became distorted, filled with static that made me wince. Gabriel's voice dropped to a fearful whisper. "Do you hear that?" On screen, all 3 boys turned toward something off camera. The image quality degraded, becoming grainy and unstable. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen, trying to make out what had frightened them. A figure moved between the trees, tall, thin, definitely human, but somehow wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The person wore dark clothing and moved with an unnatural stillness, like they were trying to remain unseen. Benedict screamed, the same terrifying sound I'd heard from the kitchen. The camera shook violently as Gabriel ran, branches whipping past the lens in blurred streaks. I caught glimpses of the twins' terrified faces, heard their panicked breathing mixing with the static. Behind them, barely visible in the chaotic footage, the figure followed with patient persistence. The screen went black for several seconds. When the image returned, it showed a different scene entirely, one that made me vomit into the trash can beside my bed. The final footage was clearer, but infinitely more horrifying. Benedict and Blake appeared bound to trees, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. They struggled against rope restraints, their muffled cries barely audible through what appeared to be makeshift gags. The figure moved into frame, a man in his 40s or 50s, unremarkable except for the surgical precision with which he worked. His face was calm, almost bored, as he systematically tortured the twins. The audio captured every scream, every plea, every wet sound I wished I could forget. Gabriel's camera captured it all from a hiding spot, the lens shaking with his terrified breathing. Occasionally, his whispered prayers to God broke through the static. "Please help them. Please make it stop. Please." The man worked methodically, taking his time. When the twins finally stopped moving, he turned his attention to finding Gabriel. The camera showed the killer moving through the trees, calling out in a friendly voice, "I know you're there, little filmmaker. I saw your camera. Why don't you come out and we can talk?" The footage ended abruptly with Gabriel's final scream, the camera falling to the ground and showing only dirt and pine needles. I sat in stunned silence, my entire body trembling. This wasn't some random tragedy or animal attack. A human being had systematically hunted and murdered 3 children, and somehow the police had let this information slip through the cracks. I couldn't let it go. For weeks, the images haunted me. Not supernatural horror, but the very real evil that human beings were capable of inflicting on innocents. I researched everything I could find about similar cases in the area, discovering a pattern of missing children dating back decades. The man in the footage was still out there, still hunting. Late one night, I made a decision that would have horrified my parents. I packed a backpack with supplies, took my father's hunting rifle from the gun safe, and drove back to Millwood. I knew exactly where Gabriel had been found, and I had a theory about where his killer might return. The forest at night was a different world, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a reason to freeze and listen. I made my way to Whitewater Canyon, following the same path the killer had used. The beam of my flashlight cut through absolute darkness, illuminating gnarled tree roots and jagged rocks. I found his camp 3 hours before dawn, a carefully concealed shelter built into a rocky outcropping, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, I discovered a collection that made my stomach turn. Photographs, personal items, and video equipment. Dozens of children's faces stared back at me from Polaroid pictures, their terror captured forever. When he returned just after sunrise, I was waiting. The man who had killed my brother looked so ordinary, medium height, graying hair, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second thought. He saw me immediately, saw the rifle in my hands, and smiled like we were old friends meeting for coffee. "You must be the brother," he said casually, setting down a canvas bag. "I was hoping you'd figure it out eventually. Most families never do." I wanted to say something profound, something that would honor Gabriel's memory or provide closure for our family. Instead, I simply pulled the trigger. The police found his body 3 days later, along with evidence linking him to 17 missing children across 3 counties. The official report listed his death as suicide, a conclusion that satisfied everyone who mattered. I never told anyone what really happened in those woods. Some secrets are meant to be kept, some justice administered in darkness. Gabriel and the twins finally had peace, and the families of 16 other children could finally stop wondering. But late at night, when Cedar Heights grows quiet, and the city's noise fades to a whisper, I still see that ordinary-looking man's smile. I still remember how easily evil can hide behind a human face, how predators walk among us wearing masks of normalcy. The real monsters aren't supernatural creatures lurking in shadows. They're the humans who choose to become monsters, and sometimes the only way to stop them is to become something monstrous yourself. I sleep better now, knowing Gabriel's killer will never hurt another child. But I also know there are others out there, waiting in their own dark corners of the world. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, I wonder if I'll need to find them too. I never should have believed that moving to the cabin would bring us peace. That's what I told myself every day after we'd settled into the remote property nestled against the western slope of Pine Ridge. My wife Anna had fallen in love with the place the moment she saw the listing online. A rustic two-bedroom cabin surrounded by dense woodland, miles from the nearest neighbor. The isolation appealed to her after years of city noise and crowded streets. The cabin sat in a small clearing, its weathered cedar walls blending seamlessly with the towering pines that stretched up the mountainside. During our first week there in late September of 2021, I had to admit the place had its charm. The morning mist would roll through the trees like ghostly fingers, and the sunset painted the ridge in brilliant oranges and purples. Anna spent hours on the wraparound porch, sketching the landscape and breathing in the crisp mountain air. But even from the beginning, something felt wrong about the ridge itself. The trees grew unnaturally thin and tall, their branches reaching toward the sky like desperate hands. When the wind moved through them, they created a sound I'd never heard before, not quite a whistle, not quite a moan, but something that made the hair on my neck stand up. The local hardware store owner, an elderly man named Pete Morrison, had given us odd looks when we mentioned where we'd moved. "That's been empty for 3 years," he'd said, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Previous owners left in a hurry. Never said why." Anna had laughed it off, claiming Pete was just trying to drum up local gossip. But I noticed how he avoided eye contact when he handed us our change, and how he'd crossed himself when we walked out the door. The first month passed without incident. I worked remotely from the cabin's small office, video conferencing with clients while Anna explored the surrounding forest. She'd return each evening with wildflowers, interesting rocks, or sketches of wildlife she'd spotted. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I began to relax into our new routine. It was during the second week of October that Anna first mentioned hearing sounds at night. She'd wake me gently, whispering that she thought she'd heard something moving outside our bedroom window. I'd listen carefully but hear nothing except the usual forest sounds, owls hooting, branches creaking, the occasional rustle of a nocturnal animal foraging for food. "Old cabin settling," I'd tell her, pulling her close. "These places make all kinds of noise." But Anna would lie awake long after I'd fallen back asleep, her body tense against mine, her breathing shallow and rapid. During the day, she'd examine the ground around the cabin, looking for tracks or signs of whatever might have disturbed her rest. She never found anything conclusive, just the usual deer prints and bird tracks that marked any forest floor. The nights grew longer as autumn deepened, and with them came a change in Anna's behavior. She became obsessed with watching the ridge, standing at our bedroom window each morning with a cup of coffee, studying the tree line with an intensity that unsettled me. When I asked what she was looking for, she'd just shake her head and say she couldn't explain it. "There's something up there," she'd whisper, her fingers tracing condensation patterns on the glass. "Something watching." I'd join her at the window, scanning the distant trees for any sign of movement. The ridge loomed above us like a wall of darkness, its peak hidden in perpetual shadow even during the brightest days. Sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of movement among the trees, a branch swaying against the wind, a shadow shifting where no shadow should be. But whenever I focused on a specific spot, there was nothing there. The temperature dropped dramatically as October gave way to November, and we began burning wood in the fireplace every evening. Anna would curl up in the armchair closest to the window, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes constantly drifting toward the ridge. She'd stopped sketching, stopped collecting flowers, stopped talking about how much she loved our new home. Instead, she'd sit in silence, occasionally tilting her head as if listening for something I couldn't hear. When I tried to engage her in conversation, she'd respond with distracted murmurs, her attention always somewhere else. The vibrant, curious woman I'd married was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone hollow-eyed and distant. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I called out to Anna to ask if she wanted red wine or white with our meal. When she didn't respond, I walked into the living room to find her standing pressed against the window, her palms flat against the glass, her breath fogging the surface. "Anna?" I said, touching her shoulder. She startled, spinning around with wild eyes. For a moment, she looked at me as if she didn't recognize me, her face pale and drawn. Then recognition flickered in her expression, and she forced a smile. "Sorry," she said, her voice hoarse. "I thought I saw something." That night, I called Anna's sister Helen in Denver, explaining that the isolation might be affecting Anna's mental state. Helen listened with growing concern, reminding me that Anna had always been sensitive to her environment, prone to anxiety in new situations. "Maybe you should come back to the city for a while," Helen suggested, "just until she adjusts." But when I broached the subject with Anna, she became agitated, insisting we couldn't leave. She claimed the ridge needed us, that something important was happening that we couldn't abandon. Her words made no sense, but the desperate look in her eyes convinced me to let the matter drop, at least temporarily. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have packed our bags that very night and driven back to civilization. Instead, I told myself that Anna just needed more time to settle in, that the stress of the move was manifesting in unusual ways. I rationalized every strange behavior, every sleepless night, every hour she spent staring at the ridge with an expression I couldn't interpret. The first snow fell on November 15th, dusting the ridge with white and making the skeletal trees look even more ominous against the gray sky. Anna watched it fall with an expression of anticipation that chilled me more than the dropping temperature. She pressed her face against the cold window glass, her breath creating expanding circles of fog. "It's beautiful," she whispered, though her tone suggested she was seeing something entirely different from the peaceful winter scene I observed. That night, the sounds began. The scratching started just after midnight. I'd been deep in sleep when the sound pulled me back to consciousness, a rhythmic scraping against the cabin's exterior walls, like fingernails dragging across wood. My eyes snapped open, and I lay perfectly still, straining to identify the source. Anna was already awake beside me, her body rigid with tension. "Do you hear it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound. The scratching moved along the wall, slow and deliberate, passing beneath our bedroom window. It paused directly outside, and in that moment of silence, I could hear something else. A wet, ragged breathing that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. I slipped out of bed as quietly as possible, grabbing the baseball bat I'd started keeping beside the nightstand. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and immediately the sounds outside stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been, pregnant with malevolent intent. Moving to the window, I carefully pulled back the curtain and peered out into the darkness. The snow-covered clearing was empty, unmarked by footprints or tracks. But at the edge of the forest, something moved. A pale shape detached itself from the shadows between the trees, upright, but wrong somehow, its proportions defying natural anatomy. It stood approximately 8 feet tall, its limbs grotesquely elongated and thin. What should have been its head swayed back and forth with mechanical precision, scanning the cabin's facade. Even from a distance, I could see that its skin was the color of bleached bone, stretched taut over a skeletal frame that looked barely capable of supporting its own weight. "God help us," I breathed, stepping back from the window. The thing's head snapped toward our bedroom with inhuman speed, as if it had heard my whispered words. For several heartbeats, it remained motionless, focused on our window. Then, with movements that defied physics, it dropped to all fours and began moving toward the cabin. Its gait was wrong, joints bending in directions they shouldn't, limbs extending and contracting with each step like the legs of some massive spider. The sight of it moving across the snow without leaving tracks made my stomach lurch with primal terror. Anna had joined me at the window, her face pressed against the glass. Instead of horror, Her expression showed a mixture of fascination and recognition that terrified me more than the creature itself. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her breath fogging the window. Beautiful? The thing currently circling our cabin was the antithesis of beauty, a mockery of human form that violated every natural law. Its movements were predatory, calculated, as if it were studying the structure of our home for weaknesses. "Anna, get away from the window," I hissed, pulling her back. But she resisted, reaching toward the glass as if trying to touch the creature outside. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and her eyes reflected the moonlight with an intensity that reminded me uncomfortably of the thing stalking around our cabin. The creature completed its circuit of the building and returned to its original position at the forest's edge. It rose to its full height again, that eyeless head turning toward our window one final time. Then it melted back into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. We stood in darkness for another hour, waiting for it to return. Anna remained at the window, her hands pressed against the glass, her breathing slow and regular despite what we just witnessed. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop shaking, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. When morning came, I searched the area around the cabin thoroughly. The snow showed no signs of disturbance, no tracks, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. But I found something else that made my blood freeze. A series of deep scratches in the cabin's siding, too high and too perfectly spaced to have been made by any normal animal. "Probably just a bear," I told Anna over breakfast, though I didn't believe it myself. She looked at me with those two bright eyes and smiled. "Of course it was," she agreed. But her tone suggested she knew exactly what had visited us and was pleased by the encounter. That day, Anna's behavior became even more erratic. She spent hours sitting on the porch despite the freezing temperature, wrapped in blankets and staring at the ridge with unwavering attention. When I tried to convince her to come inside, she'd claim she wasn't cold, that she felt perfectly comfortable. Her skin told a different story. It had taken on a bluish tinge, and when I touched her hands, they were ice cold despite her insistence that she felt warm. She'd stopped eating regular meals, picking at her food with obvious disinterest. The only time she showed any energy was when discussing the visitor from the previous night. "It's not dangerous," she told me during one of our increasingly strained conversations. "It's just curious about us. About me." The way she emphasized that last word sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Anna was changing, becoming something I didn't recognize. The woman who used to jump at her own shadow was now eager to encounter a creature that had filled me with more terror than anything I'd ever experienced. I tried calling Helen again, but Anna intercepted the call, snatching the phone from my hands and ending it before I could explain what was happening. Her strength surprised me. She'd always been petite and delicate, but she gripped the phone with enough force to crack the plastic case. "We don't need help," she said, her voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before. "Everything is exactly as it should be." That night, I barely slept. Every sound from outside made me reach for the baseball bat, my heart hammering against my ribs. But Anna slept peacefully beside me, a serene smile playing on her lips, as if she were having the most pleasant dreams imaginable. Around 3 a.m., I woke to find her side of the bed empty. Panic seized me as I searched the cabin, calling her name in harsh whispers. I found her standing on the porch in nothing but her nightgown, her bare feet planted in the snow, her arms raised toward the ridge as if in worship. The creature was there too, closer than it had been the night before. It stood just 20 feet from the porch steps, its pale form clearly visible in the moonlight. Anna was speaking to it in a language I didn't recognize. Guttural sounds mixed with whispered syllables that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my skull. When I grabbed Anna's arm to pull her inside, her skin was burning hot despite her exposure to the frigid air. She turned toward me with eyes that reflected light like an animal's, and for a terrifying moment, I saw something else looking out through her familiar features. "It's teaching me," she said in a voice that sounded layered, as if multiple people were speaking through her throat simultaneously. The creature watched this exchange with what I can only describe as satisfaction before retreating into the forest. I carried Anna inside, her body limp and compliant, and wrapped her in every blanket I could find. Her fever broke just before dawn, leaving her weak and disoriented, with no memory of her midnight encounter. But the change in her was permanent now. Something fundamental had shifted during those few minutes on the porch, something that transformed my wife into a stranger wearing her face. By the third week of November, Anna had stopped sleeping altogether. I'd find her wandering the cabin at all hours, sometimes standing motionless in the middle of rooms, staring at nothing. Her eyes had developed a glassy quality, like those of a person in a catatonic state, yet she moved with purpose and responded to direct questions with disturbing clarity. The physical changes were impossible to ignore. Anna had always been slender, but now she appeared gaunt, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had taken on a translucent quality. Veins showed dark blue beneath the surface, creating intricate patterns across her arms and throat. When she smiled, which she did often now, though never in response to anything I found amusing, her teeth seemed too large for her mouth. She'd developed an aversion to cooked food, preferring raw vegetables and meat. I'd catch her in the kitchen at dawn, gnawing on carrots or celery with an intensity that suggested hunger, but not of any normal kind. The sound of her chewing filled me with inexplicable revulsion, a wet, grinding noise that seemed to echo throughout the cabin. Most disturbing were the conversations she claimed to be having. I'd hear her voice from other rooms, speaking in animated tones as if engaged in deep discussion with someone. But when I investigated, I'd find her alone, sometimes gesturing toward empty air, sometimes pressed against windows that looked out onto empty forest. "Who were you talking to?" I asked one morning after hearing her laugh, a sound unlike any she'd ever made before, high-pitched and trilling. "My friend," she replied simply, as if this explained everything. "What friend? There's no one here but us." Anna tilted her head, studying me with those unsettling eyes. "You can't see him yet, but you will." The certainty in her voice made my stomach churn. I'd started researching psychiatric facilities in the area, convinced that Anna was suffering some kind of psychotic break triggered by our isolation. But every time I tried to discuss getting help, she'd become agitated, sometimes violent, insisting that nothing was wrong with her. "I'm becoming what I was always meant to be," she told me during one particularly heated argument. "Why can't you understand that?" Her words echoed in my mind as I lay awake that night, listening to her move through the cabin below. The floorboards creaked rhythmically as if she were pacing in perfect circles. Occasionally, I'd hear that laugh again, and each time it sounded less human. I started documenting her behavior, hoping to build a case for involuntary commitment if necessary. The notes I wrote during those days read like horror fiction, describing a woman who barely resembled the person I'd married. November 20th. Anna spent 4 hours standing at the kitchen window, not moving, barely blinking. When I spoke to her, she said she was listening to the mountain. Her pulse is abnormally slow, maybe 40 beats per minute. November 22nd. Found her in the basement this morning, kneeling on the concrete floor. She'd arranged various objects in a circle around herself. Kitchen utensils, pieces of torn fabric, what looked like small bones. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was preparing. For what, she wouldn't say. November 24th. Anna hasn't eaten anything in 3 days, but shows no signs of weakness or hunger. If anything, she seems stronger. She moved the couch by herself yesterday, something that normally required both of us. Her body temperature fluctuates wildly, sometimes burning hot, sometimes cold enough to make me shiver when I touch her. The creature's visits became more frequent and bold. Every night it would emerge from the ridge, approaching closer to the cabin with each appearance. I'd watch from the bedroom window as Anna met it on the porch, the two of them communicating in that strange language of growls and whispers. During one of these encounters, I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. Anna had extended her hand toward the creature, and it had reached out with one of its impossibly long arms to touch her fingers. The moment of contact created a visible spark like static electricity, and Anna's entire body convulsed with what appeared to be ecstasy. When she came back inside, her transformation accelerated dramatically. Her spine curved in a way that suggested her vertebrae had shifted, and her fingers had grown noticeably longer, the nails hardening into claw-like points. She walked differently too, with a fluid grace that reminded me uncomfortably of the creature's movements. I tried to reason with her, to remind her of our life together, our plans for the future. But Anna looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, her head tilted at an angle that hurt my neck to watch. "That person is gone," she said matter-of-factly. "I'm better now. Better." The word haunted me as I realized I was sharing my home with something that wore my wife's face but contained an alien intelligence. The Anna I'd known and loved had been replaced by a changeling, a hollow shell animated by something that had crawled down from the ridge to claim her. I started making plans to escape, gathering important documents and cash while Anna was distracted by her nightly communions. But she seemed to sense my intentions with that uncanny awareness she'd developed, watching me with predatory attention whenever I moved through the cabin. "You're not thinking of leaving, are you?" she asked one evening, her voice carrying a note of menace I'd never heard from her before. "Of course not," I lied, my heart racing. Anna smiled, revealing teeth that were definitely sharper than they'd been that morning. "Good, because we can't leave now, not when we're so close to understanding." "Understanding what?" I wanted to ask, but the look in her eyes discouraged further questions. Instead, I nodded and retreated to our bedroom, where I spent another sleepless night planning my escape and praying for the courage to execute it. The opportunity came sooner than expected, though not in a way I could have anticipated. On November 28th, a snowstorm hit the ridge with unprecedented fury. Wind howled around the cabin with such violence that the entire structure shook, and snow accumulated so quickly that within hours our windows were partially buried. The power lines went down just after sunset, plunging us into darkness except for the flickering light of candles and the dying fire in the fireplace. I expected Anna to be distressed by the storm, but instead, she seemed energized by it. She moved through the cabin with electric excitement, preparing for something I couldn't understand. She'd gathered various objects from around the house, mirrors, metal utensils, pieces of jewelry, and arranged them in complex patterns throughout the rooms. "It's time," she announced as the storm reached its peak, her voice carrying over the howling wind. "Time for what?" I demanded, but she was already moving toward the front door. I grabbed her arm, alarmed by her intention to go outside in such dangerous conditions. But the moment I made contact, pain shot through my hand like an electric shock. Anna's skin was radiating heat intense enough to burn, and the smell of scorched flesh filled my nostrils. She turned to look at me, and I saw that her eyes had changed completely. What had once been hazel irises were now solid black, reflecting the candlelight like obsidian mirrors. The intelligence behind them was ancient and predatory, nothing remotely human. "Don't touch me again," she said in a voice layered with harmonics that made my teeth ache. I stumbled backward, cradling my burned hand, as Anna opened the door and stepped into the storm. The wind and snow immediately filled the cabin, extinguishing several candles and sending papers flying. Through the doorway, I could see Anna standing motionless in the swirling white chaos, her nightgown whipping around her body, but her hair hanging straight down as if unaffected by the gale. The creature emerged from the storm like something born from the tempest itself. It was larger than I'd seen it before, its pale skin gleaming with an inner light that made it visible despite the blizzard. As it approached Anna, its movements became more fluid, more graceful, as if the storm gave it strength. They met in the center of the clearing, and what happened next defied every natural law I understood. The space around them began to distort, reality bending like heated glass. The snow falling between them curved and spiraled, forming intricate patterns that hung in the air despite the chaotic wind. Anna raised her arms toward the creature, and it responded by placing its impossibly long hands on her shoulders. The moment they made contact, both figures began to change. Anna's body stretched and elongated, her spine extending with audible pops and cracks. Her skin paled to match the creature's bone-white complexion, and her fingers grew into the same sharp-tipped appendages I'd watched her develop over the past weeks. The creature, meanwhile, was becoming more human-like, its features softening and condensing into something that might have been handsome, if not for the absolute absence of warmth in its black eyes. It was as if they were trading essences, each becoming more like the other. I watched in horror from the doorway, too terrified to move, as my wife completed her transformation into something monstrous. When the process finished, two identical creatures stood in the clearing, their pale forms radiating that same unsettling inner light. They turned toward me simultaneously, and I saw Anna's face, or what had been her face, twisted into an expression of malicious joy. Her mouth opened wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and she spoke in that layered voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Now you understand," she said. "This is what I was always meant to become." I slammed the door and threw the bolt, my mind reeling with the impossibility of what I'd witnessed. Behind the door, I could hear them moving, circling the cabin with that same predatory patience the original creature had shown. Sometimes they'd scratch at the walls or windows, testing for weaknesses, their claws leaving deep gouges in the wood. The storm raged for 3 days, and for 3 days I was trapped in the cabin with those things prowling outside. They seemed to enjoy tormenting me, appearing at windows when I least expected it, their faces pressed against the glass with expressions of inhuman hunger. The creature that had been Anna would mouth words at me through the windows. My name, endearments from our past life together, promises of what would happen when they finally got inside. I rationed the remaining candles and what little food was left in the pantry, knowing that if the storm didn't end soon, I'd have no choice but to face them. The cold was becoming unbearable with the power out, and I could see ice crystals forming on the inside walls of the cabin. On the third night, the scratching at the walls became more aggressive. They'd found a loose board near the foundation and were working to pry it free. I could hear their whispered conversations through the gap they'd created, planning in that guttural language how they would enter and what they would do to me. I spent that night huddled in the bathroom, the only room in the cabin without windows, clutching the baseball bat and praying for dawn. The sounds of their efforts filled the house. Splintering wood, the screech of nails being pulled free, the occasional thump as they tested their progress. Just before sunrise, the sound stopped. I waited another hour before emerging from the bathroom, expecting to find them inside the cabin. Instead, I found the front door standing wide open. Snow drifted across the floor, and 2 sets of tracks leading away toward the ridge. They were gone, but I knew it was only temporary. Whatever Anna had become, whatever the creature had made her, they would return when they were ready to finish what they'd started. The storm had passed, leaving the forest in crystalline silence. I had perhaps hours before they decided to come back, and I intended to use every minute to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. I didn't waste time gathering belongings or trying to salvage anything from the cabin. Within an hour of realizing the creatures had withdrawn, I was in my truck, the engine running and heat blasting as I navigated the treacherous mountain road. The snow had made driving dangerous, but staying was certain death. The truck struggled through the deep drifts, tires spinning and sliding on the icy surface. More than once I thought I'd become stuck, but desperation gave me the patience to rock the vehicle free and continue down the mountain. Every few minutes I'd check the rearview mirror, expecting to see pale figures pursuing me through the trees, but the forest remained empty. It took 3 hours to cover what should have been a 40-minute drive to town. By the time I reached the main highway, my hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel, and my jaw ached from clenching my teeth. But I'd made it. I was away from the ridge, away from whatever Anna had become. In town, I went straight to the sheriff's office, bursting through the doors like a madman. Sheriff Patricia Valdez looked up from her paperwork with the weary expression of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations, but her demeanor changed when she saw my condition. "Sir, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out in a jumbled rush that made no sense even to me. How do you tell a law enforcement officer that your wife has transformed into some kind of mountain monster? How do you describe creatures that defy natural law without sounding completely insane? Sheriff Valdez listened patiently, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. She was professional and kind, but I could see the skepticism growing in her eyes as my story became more outlandish. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me carefully. "Mr. Henderson, when's the last time you slept? Or ate a full meal?" The question caught me off guard. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done either. The stress and terror of the past weeks had taken a physical toll I hadn't acknowledged. I probably did look like a crazy person, unshaven, hollow-eyed, rambling about monsters. "Look," Sheriff Valdez continued gently, "isolation can play tricks on the mind. You and your wife have been alone up there for months. Sometimes people start seeing things, hearing things that aren't really there." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I'd witnessed was real, but doubt crept into my thoughts. Had the isolation affected my sanity? Were the creatures manifestations of stress-induced psychosis? The rational part of my mind seized on this explanation, desperately wanting to believe that Anna was still Anna, that she was back at the cabin worried about my disappearance. "We need to do a wellness check on your wife," the sheriff said, reaching for her radio. "Send Deputy Martinez up to the Pine Ridge cabin to check on a possible domestic situation." "No!" I shouted, startling both of us with the vehemence of my response. "You can't send someone up there alone. If I'm right, if any of this is real, you'll be sending him to his death." Sheriff Valdez studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, we'll go together. But I need you to understand that if your wife is hurt or missing, there will be serious questions about your story." I agreed, relief flooding through me. At least they'd see for themselves what was up there. Evidence of the creature's presence would vindicate my claims and hopefully lead to some kind of rescue operation for Anna, if any part of her still existed within that transformed shell. We drove up the mountain in the sheriff's SUV, equipped with chains and emergency gear. I directed her to the cabin, my anxiety growing with each mile we climbed. What would we find? Had the creatures returned? Was Anna back to her human form? Or would Sheriff Valdez encounter the nightmare I'd fled from? The cabin looked normal from the outside, almost disappointingly so. Snow covered the roof and surrounded the building in pristine white drifts. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was inside maintaining a fire. If not for the deep scratches in the siding and the broken board near the foundation, it would have looked like a picture from a Christmas card. "Anna," Sheriff Valdez called out as we approached the front porch. "This is the sheriff. We're here to check on your welfare." The door opened, and Anna appeared. She looked exactly as she had on the day we'd first visited the cabin. Healthy, beautiful, completely human. She wore jeans and a sweater I recognized, her hair pulled back in the messy bun she favored when relaxing at home. When she saw me, her face lit up with joy and relief. "Thank God you're all right," she exclaimed, rushing down the steps to embrace me. "I was so worried when you disappeared in the storm. I thought something terrible had happened." Her body felt normal against mine, warm, soft, familiar. There was no trace of the burning heat or unnatural strength I'd experienced during her transformation. She smelled like the lavender soap she'd always used, and when she pulled back to look at me, her eyes were their original hazel color. "I'm so sorry," she continued, tears streaming down her face. I know I've been acting strangely lately. The isolation, the stress of the move. I think I had some kind of breakdown. I barely remember the past few weeks. It's like I was in a fog. Sheriff Valdez questioned Anna thoroughly, but her answers were consistent and reasonable. She claimed to have no memory of the events I'd described, attributing her recent behavior to stress and possible sleepwalking episodes. She showed no signs of injury or coercion, and her demeanor was that of a woman genuinely concerned about her husband's psychological state. I think he's been having nightmares, Anna told the sheriff. He'd wake up screaming about monsters and creatures. I was planning to suggest he see someone when the storm hit and he disappeared. As we drove back down the mountain, Sheriff Valdez's attitude toward me had shifted from concern to suspicion. She suggested I seek professional help for what she clearly believed was a stress-induced breakdown, and warned me that making false reports was a serious matter. But I knew what I'd seen. The Anna who'd embraced me at the cabin wasn't my wife. She was something else wearing Anna's form with perfect precision. The real Anna was gone, consumed or transformed beyond recognition, and the thing that had taken her place was playing a role to perfection. That night, in a motel room in town, I lay awake planning my next move. I couldn't return to the cabin, couldn't live with the creature that had replaced my wife. But I also couldn't convince anyone else of the truth. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making, suspected of harming the woman I'd tried to save. The phone rang at 3 a.m. I knew who it would be before I answered. "Hello, darling," Anna's voice said sweetly. "Why don't you come home?" I changed motels 3 times that week, paying cash and using false names, but somehow Anna always found my number. The calls came at random hours, sometimes her familiar voice pleading for me to return, sometimes that layered, inhuman sound that made my skull ache. She knew things she shouldn't know, which room I was staying in, what I'd eaten for dinner, conversations I'd had with the motel staff. "You can't hide from me forever," she said during one particularly chilling call. "I know you better than you know yourself. I know how you think, how you move, how you smell when you're afraid." The certainty in her voice convinced me that staying in the area was suicide. Whatever Anna had become possessed abilities that normal law enforcement couldn't counter. I needed to put distance between myself and the ridge, needed to disappear completely until I could figure out how to handle the situation. I withdrew everything from our joint bank accounts, knowing the transactions would leave a trail, but needing the resources more than anonymity. The money would have to last until I could establish a new identity somewhere far from Colorado. I bought a used car with cash, leaving my truck abandoned in the motel parking lot, and headed east toward states where no one knew my name. But Anna was hunting me. The first sign came in Kansas, 3 days into my flight. I'd stopped at a truck stop for gas and food, trying to blend in with the crowd of travelers. While filling the tank, I noticed a woman across the lot watching me with familiar intensity. She was tall and pale, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit right, and when our eyes met, she smiled with teeth that caught the fluorescent lights in an unnatural way. I abandoned the gas pump and drove away without paying, my heart hammering as I checked the mirrors obsessively. The woman didn't follow, but I knew she'd report my location to something that would. Anna had found allies, or created them, spreading her influence beyond the ridge. In Missouri, I saw another one. This time it was a man working at a diner where I'd stopped for breakfast. He moved with that same fluid grace I'd watched Anna develop, and his eyes held that predatory intelligence I'd learned to fear. When he brought my coffee, his fingers were too long, the nails filed to sharp points. "Your wife sends her regards," he whispered as he set down the cup. I left money on the table and ran, abandoning my meal and fleeing toward the interstate. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature waiter standing in the diner's doorway, watching my departure with satisfaction. They were everywhere, a network of transformed beings spread across the country like a plague. Each one I encountered looked human at first glance, but closer inspection revealed the telltale signs. The too pale skin, the elongated limbs, the black eyes that reflected light like mirrors. They worked in gas stations, restaurants, hotels, anywhere a traveler might stop. All of them watching, waiting, reporting my movements back to their mistress. I realized the scope of what I was dealing with extended far beyond Anna and the creature from the ridge. This was an infestation, a coordinated effort to transform humanity one person at a time. Anna had been just the beginning, patient zero in an epidemic of monstrous change. The phone calls continued, taunting me with promises of what would happen when they finally caught up. Anna's voice had lost all pretense of humanity now, speaking in that multi-layered tone that suggested multiple entities speaking through her throat simultaneously. "You're only delaying the inevitable," she told me during a call that came through the radio of my stolen car. Somehow she'd found a frequency I couldn't escape. "Every mile you run, we grow stronger. Every person you meet becomes one of us. Soon there will be nowhere left to hide." I drove without stopping except for fuel, existing on gas station coffee and vending machine food, afraid to interact with people any longer than necessary. My reflection in rest stop mirrors showed a man pushed beyond his limits, hollow-eyed, gaunt, trembling with exhaustion and terror. I looked like the crazy person everyone assumed I was. In Tennessee, they nearly got me. I'd foolishly chosen to spend the night in a motel, desperate for a shower and a few hours of real sleep. But I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of scratching on my door. That same rhythmic scraping I'd first heard at the cabin. Through the window, I could see pale figures moving in the parking lot, their elongated forms gliding between cars with predatory purpose. There were at least 6 of them, maybe more lurking beyond the range of the security lights. They'd found me somehow, tracked me to this anonymous roadside stop in the middle of nowhere. As I watched in growing horror, more figures emerged from the surrounding darkness, converging on the motel like wolves closing in on wounded prey. I gathered my few possessions and climbed out the bathroom window, dropping into the darkness behind the building. The creatures were focused on the front entrance, apparently unaware of my escape route. I made it to my car and drove away with the headlights off, navigating by moonlight until I was sure they weren't following. But I knew they'd track me again. The network was too vast, too well coordinated. No matter where I went, eventually one of them would spot me and alert the others. I was being herded like cattle, driven toward some predetermined destination where Anna waited to finish what she'd started. The revelation came in Virginia, during what I thought would be my final hours of freedom. I'd been driving for 18 hours straight, sustained only by caffeine and terror. When exhaustion finally overcame fear, I pulled into an abandoned gas station to rest for a few minutes, just long enough to clear my head and plan my next move. That's when I saw the newspaper clipping taped to the inside of the gas station window. It was yellowed with age, dated 15 years earlier, but the headline made my blood freeze. "Family disappears from mountain cabin. Search called off after strange encounters." The article described a family of 4 who'd vanished from a remote cabin on Pine Ridge. Searchers had found evidence of struggle but no bodies, and several rescue workers reported encountering unidentified figures in the forest. The search was abandoned after 2 volunteers disappeared without explanation. Below that article was another, dated 10 years earlier, describing similar disappearances at the same location. And below that, another from 20 years ago. The pattern went back decades, maybe longer. Families drawn to the ridge, isolated and transformed, then used to spread the contagion further into the world. Anna and I hadn't been the first victims. We were just the latest in a long line of people chosen for our isolation, our vulnerability, our potential usefulness to whatever intelligence controlled the creatures. The cabin had been bait, designed to lure unsuspecting couples away from civilization where they could be harvested without interference. I understood then that running was futile. The network would continue to grow, spreading from city to city until the entire country was infected. Anna hadn't been transformed randomly. She'd been selected, cultivated, prepared for her role in a plan that spanned generations. The phone in the abandoned gas station rang, its shrill tone cutting through the night silence. I knew I shouldn't answer, but compulsion drew me toward it anyway. When I lifted the receiver, Anna's voice filled my ear, closer than it had ever sounded. "You understand now," she said. "You see the beauty of what we're building. A world without fear, without pain, without the petty concerns that plague humanity. We offer perfection, immortality, unity of purpose." "You offer death," I whispered. Anna laughed, that terrible multi-layered sound that spoke of things beyond human comprehension. "Death is just the doorway. What waits beyond is far more wonderful than anything you've ever imagined." Through the gas station windows, I could see lights approaching from multiple directions. They'd found me again, and this time there would be no escape. The creatures were closing in, their pale forms becoming visible in the darkness as they surrounded the building. "Come home," Anna said softly. "Let me show you what you could become." I hung up the phone and drew the pistol I'd bought in Arkansas, my last resort, saved for the moment when capture became inevitable. But as I watched the creatures approach, moving with that inhuman grace that violated every natural law, I realized even this final option might not be enough. They wanted me alive. They wanted me conscious and aware when the transformation began, wanted me to experience every moment of my humanity being stripped away and replaced with something alien and hungry. Death would be a mercy they weren't prepared to grant. The first creature reached the door, its elongated fingers wrapping around the handle with delicate precision. Others pressed against the windows, their black eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights like dark stars. They moved without urgency, confident in their superiority, savoring the moment of inevitable victory. But I still had one option left, one chance to deny them their prize and perhaps warn others about the threat growing in the mountains of Colorado. If I couldn't escape, at least I could ensure my story survived to reach someone who might believe it, someone who might be able to stop the spread of this contagion before it consumed everything. The creatures entered the gas station like smoke, flowing through the doorway with impossible fluidity. Their leader was tall and pale, its features a perfect mockery of human beauty marred by those terrible black eyes. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made my bones ache. "You have led us quite a chase," it said, advancing slowly across the linoleum floor. "But it ends now. You will come with us willingly, or we will take you by force. Either way, you will be transformed." I raised the pistol, knowing it was useless but needing to maintain some illusion of control. "Stay back. I'll shoot." The creature smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Bullets cannot harm what we have become. Pain is meaningless to us now. We are beyond such crude physical limitations." Behind it, the other creatures spread out through the gas station, cutting off any possible escape routes. Their movements were coordinated with military precision, each one positioned to prevent my flight in any direction. They had done this before, many times, perfecting their technique through decades of practice. But they had made one mistake in their confidence. They assumed I intended to shoot them. Instead, I turned the pistol toward my own head. The creatures froze the moment they realized my intention. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something resembling fear in their black eyes. Their confident advance stopped, and the leader raised one elongated hand in a gesture of caution. "You do not want to do that," it said, its voice losing some of its inhuman resonance and taking on an almost pleading quality. "Death is not escape. Death is merely transition to a state where we have even greater control over your essence." The words chilled me more than any threat could have. They were saying that even in death, I wouldn't be free from their influence. Whatever they were, whatever power they drew from, it extended beyond the boundaries of life itself. "You're lying," I said, though doubt crept into my voice. The creature that had been Anna stepped forward from the group, and I gasped despite myself. She looked exactly as she had on our wedding day, radiant, beautiful, perfect in every detail. But the intelligence behind her eyes was ancient and malevolent, wearing her form like an elaborate costume. "Darling," she said in her original voice, the sound so perfectly Anna that tears sprang to my eyes. "I would never lie to you. Death won't end your suffering, it will only make it eternal. But transformation offers infinite possibility. You could be like me, like us, perfect, immortal, free from every limitation that has ever constrained you." I wanted to believe her lies, wanted to accept the comfort of surrender. The gun trembled in my hands as exhaustion and despair warred with my last fragments of sanity. What was the point of continuing to fight when the entire world seemed infected by their influence? "Look around you," Anna continued, gesturing toward the other creatures. Each of them was once human, once afraid, once limited by mortality and flesh. Now they are part of something greater, a collective consciousness that spans continents. They have knowledge beyond anything your species has ever imagined. They have purpose that transcends individual desire. As she spoke, images flashed through my mind, not my own memories, but visions planted by some external force. I saw cities where creatures like these moved openly among humans, their influence spreading through touch and proximity. I saw governments infiltrated, institutions corrupted, the entire structure of civilization slowly transformed from within. The scope of their plan was breathtaking in its ambition. They weren't just creating random monsters, they were systematically replacing humanity with something else, something that served interests I couldn't comprehend. The process had been ongoing for decades, maybe centuries, hidden in remote locations where their victims could be processed without detection. "You see now," Anna said, reading the horror in my expression. "This is not random violence or mindless hunger. This is evolution, guided by intelligence far superior to your own. We are offering your species a gift, the chance to become something greater than what you are." "By destroying everything that makes us human," I managed to say. Anna shrugged, the gesture heartbreakingly familiar despite the context. "Humanity is a failed experiment. You war among yourselves, destroy your environment, live brief, meaningless lives filled with suffering and fear. We offer something better." The pistol grew heavier in my hands as her words sank in. Part of me, the exhausted, terrified part that had been running for weeks, wanted to accept what she offered. The promise of an end to fear, to uncertainty, to the constant struggle of existence, held undeniable appeal. But another part of me, the part that remembered what Anna had been before her transformation, rebelled against the suggestion. The woman I'd loved had been flawed, certainly, but those flaws had been part of what made her human. Her capacity for joy, her ability to find beauty in simple things, her genuine concern for others. All of that was gone now, replaced by cold calculation and alien purpose. "What happened to the real Anna?" I asked. The creature wearing her face tilted its head, considering the question. "She became me. Every memory, every experience, every emotion she ever felt is now part of our collective consciousness. In a sense, she is more alive now than she ever was in her limited human form. But she's not herself anymore." "Self is an illusion," Anna replied. "Individual consciousness is a primitive stage of development. We have transcended such limitations." I thought of all the moments Anna and I had shared. Quiet mornings over coffee, late-night conversations about our dreams, the way she'd laugh at her own jokes before finishing them. All of that had been real, meaningful, precious in its imperfection. The creature before me might possess Anna's memories, but it couldn't understand why those moments had mattered. "You're wrong," I said, feeling strength return to my voice. Individuality isn't a limitation. It's what makes life worth living. The connections between people, the choices we make, the way we grow and change. That's not something to be transcended. That's something to be treasured. Anna's expression hardened, losing its artificial warmth. You cling to primitive concepts because you fear what you could become. But fear will not protect you. Your choice is simple. Join us willingly and retain some vestige of your former self, or resist and be transformed into something purely functional. The threat was clear, but it also revealed something important. They needed my cooperation for the transformation to work properly. Willing subjects retained more of their original personality, making them more effective at infiltrating human society. Resistant subjects became mere puppets, useful for labor but lacking the subtlety needed for complex deception. That knowledge gave me one final weapon against them. I understand now, I said, lowering the pistol slightly. You need people to choose transformation. Force doesn't work as well, does it? You need us to surrender willingly to get the best results. The creatures exchanged glances, confirming my suspicion. Anna stepped closer, hope flickering in her alien eyes. Yes, choice is crucial to the process, but you will choose correctly, because the alternative is existence as a mindless drone. Surely any form of consciousness is preferable to that fate. I nodded, as if considering her words, then raised the pistol again, not toward my head this time, but toward the gas pumps visible through the station window. The creatures realized my intention a split second before I pulled the trigger. The bullet shattered the pump's housing, sending sparks flying into the pool of gasoline that had accumulated around the base. The explosion was immediate and devastating, turning the entire gas station into an inferno that consumed everything within a 100-yard radius. I felt the heat wash over me in the instant before unconsciousness took hold. Saw the creatures' perfect forms beginning to burn and blister. Their screams filled the air. Not the human sounds of pain I expected, but something far worse. The sound of things not meant to exist being forced back into the void. The last thing I remember was Anna's face. Distorted by flames, but still recognizable, her expression one of genuine surprise that I'd chosen mutual destruction over surrender. When I woke up 3 days later in a hospital burn unit, the official story was that I'd been the sole survivor of a gas station explosion caused by an electrical fault. The bodies of 6 people had been found in the wreckage, but they were so badly burned that identification was impossible. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, ruling the incident an unfortunate accident. But I knew better. The creatures had been real, and I'd managed to destroy at least some of them. The question was whether I'd made any real difference, or if the network was simply too vast to be significantly damaged by one small victory. I spent 2 months in the hospital recovering from severe burns and smoke inhalation. The physical healing was nothing compared to the psychological trauma, and the staff psychiatrists were convinced I was suffering from survivor's guilt, complicated by stress-induced delusions. They had me on a cocktail of medications designed to suppress the hallucinations and help me construct a more acceptable narrative of events. But the drugs couldn't erase what I'd seen, and the official explanations couldn't account for certain inconsistencies in the evidence. The bodies found in the gas station, for instance, had been burned beyond recognition, but they'd also shown signs of anatomical abnormalities that the coroner couldn't explain. Bone structures that didn't match human norms, dental patterns unlike anything in medical literature, tissue samples that contained unknown proteins. These anomalies were quietly buried in classified reports, dismissed as artifacts of extreme heat damage. The investigators wanted a simple explanation for a complex situation, and they weren't interested in evidence that contradicted their preferred narrative. A gas station had exploded, people had died, and I was the traumatized survivor who'd invented elaborate fantasies to cope with the horror. The calls started again while I was still in the hospital. They came through the room phone at first, then through my cell phone after I'd had the room number changed. Anna's voice, as clear and present as if she were standing beside my bed. She didn't sound angry about the gas station incident. If anything, she seemed amused by my attempt at resistance. "You think you've accomplished something?" she said during one particularly long conversation. "You destroyed a few drones and temporarily disrupted our operations in that region, but we have thousands more, and the network grows stronger every day." I tried hanging up, but she called back immediately. I tried turning off the phone, but somehow her voice continued to emerge from the speaker. Technology, I was learning, was just another tool they could manipulate when it served their purposes. "The beautiful thing about your little explosion," Anna continued, "is that it provided perfect cover for our expansion. While investigators were focused on the gas station, we moved into 3 new states. While you were unconscious in your hospital bed, we transformed 47 new subjects. Your resistance is actually helping us by creating distractions." The knowledge that my actions had inadvertently aided their cause filled me with despair deeper than anything I'd experienced during my flight across the country. Every move I made seemed to play into their hands, as if they were capable of turning any opposition to their advantage. "Why don't you just transform me and be done with it?" I asked during one of our conversations. Anna laughed, that terrible multi-layered sound I'd learned to fear. "Because you're more valuable to us as you are. Your story, your desperate attempts to warn people, your obvious mental instability, all of it serves to discredit any real reports of our activities. When other survivors try to come forward, they'll be dismissed as copying your well-documented delusions." The strategy was diabolical in its simplicity. By allowing me to live and speak freely about my experiences, they were ensuring that any legitimate warnings would be ignored. I'd become the poster child for stress-induced psychosis, the cautionary tale that would silence other potential witnesses. When I was finally released from the hospital, I found myself truly alone for the first time in my adult life. My insurance had covered the medical bills, but my savings were depleted from months of flight and the expenses associated with my treatment. The cabin on Pine Ridge had burned down under mysterious circumstances while I was hospitalized, another electrical fire that left no evidence of the horrors that had occurred there. I rented a small apartment in a city where no one knew my name, paying month to month and keeping my belongings to a minimum in case I needed to run again. The paranoia never left me. Every pale stranger on the street might be one of them. Every unexpected phone call might be Anna checking on my activities. I tried to research the network using public records and internet databases, looking for patterns in missing persons reports, unexplained accidents, and similar incidents. What I found convinced me that the scope of their operation was even larger than I'd imagined. Disappearances clustered around remote locations throughout the country, mountain cabins, isolated farms, abandoned industrial sites. Each location would claim several victims over a period of years before being abandoned, allowing the heat to die down before the cycle began again, somewhere else. The pattern had been ongoing for decades, hidden in the statistical noise of a large population. But the most disturbing discovery came when I cross-referenced these disappearances with subsequent unusual incidents in nearby urban areas. Strange accidents, unexplained suicides, missing persons cases where the victims were later found behaving oddly, all occurring in the months following major disappearances at remote sites. The creatures weren't just transforming people in isolation. They were using those transformed individuals to infiltrate population centers, spreading their influence through contact with friends, family members, and co-workers. The process was slow and subtle, designed to avoid detection by authorities who weren't looking for inhuman infiltrators. I tried to warn people, posting my findings on conspiracy theory websites and forums where such information might be taken seriously. But even in those communities, my claims were considered too extreme, too lacking in verifiable evidence. The few people who expressed interest in my story invariably stopped responding to my messages after a few days, and I suspected they'd been contacted by the network and either silenced or recruited. The isolation was crushing. I'd gone from being a respected member of society to a paranoid hermit whose own family refused to speak with him. My sister Helen had visited me once in the hospital, but I could see the pity and fear in her eyes as I tried to explain what had really happened to Anna. She left believing the official story, that I'd suffered a complete psychological breakdown and needed professional help I was refusing to accept. 6 months after the gas station incident, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of Helen standing outside her Denver home, unaware she was being watched. On the back, someone had written, "Your choice," in handwriting I recognized as Anna's. The message was clear. I could continue my futile attempts to expose them, and they would target the people I cared about. Or I could remain silent, accepting my role as a discredited witness whose story served their purposes. I chose silence but not surrender. Instead of continuing my public campaign, I began documenting everything in private. Every detail of my experience, every piece of research I'd gathered, every pattern I'd identified in their operations. I stored copies in multiple locations, with instructions for publication if anything happened to me. The network might be too vast and well-established for one person to destroy, but perhaps someday someone else would encounter them and need the information I'd gathered. Perhaps a government agency would finally take the threat seriously, or a group of survivors would band together to mount organized resistance. Until then, I wait. I watch. I document every sign of their influence spreading through the world around me. The pale strangers who appear in my neighborhood, the missing persons reports that follow familiar patterns, the subtle changes in people I've known for years. They haven't contacted me directly in months now, confident that I've been neutralized as a threat. But I know Anna is still out there, still spreading her poisonous gift to new victims. Still building towards some ultimate goal I can't comprehend, but can only fear. Sometimes, late at night when the isolation becomes unbearable, I consider calling her. The number she used to contact me is still in my phone, and I know she'd answer on the first ring. Part of me wants to hear her voice again, even knowing what she's become. Part of me wonders if the creature is right, if transformation really would be preferable to this endless, fearful existence. But then I remember the Anna I loved, the real Anna, who found joy in simple pleasures and meaning in human connection. She wouldn't want me to give up my humanity, no matter how much pain it caused. She'd want me to keep fighting, to keep warning people, to resist until my last breath. So I continue. I survive. I remember. And I pray that someday, someone will read these words and understand the truth about what's happening in the shadows of our world. The creatures are real. The network is spreading. And unless someone finds a way to stop them, everything we consider human will eventually be consumed by their alien hunger. The ridge still calls to people seeking isolation and peace. New cabins are built where the old ones burned down. New families drawn by the promise of escape from urban chaos. And the cycle begins again, feeding the network with fresh victims who don't understand the true cost of their mountain paradise. Don't go to the remote places. Don't seek isolation in the wilderness. Don't trust the pale strangers who seem too perfect, too understanding, too eager to help. And if you ever receive a call from someone you love who doesn't quite sound right, who speaks with layered harmonics that make your bones ache, hang up immediately and run as far as you can. Because they're still out there, still hunting, still transforming. And the next time you see a news report about a family that's gone missing from their remote cabin, you'll know exactly what happened to them. The only question is whether anyone will believe you when you try to warn them, just as no one believed me. I never planned to be the kind of person who tells stories like this. Before everything happened, I was just a regular guy who loved the outdoors. My name is Silas Kinsley, and I've been hiking and camping since I was old enough to carry a backpack. My father taught me everything I know about the wilderness, how to read a map, start a fire, identify edible plants, and most importantly, how to respect nature. Those lessons served me well through 2 decades of solo adventures across America's wild places. Growing up in Montana gave me plenty of opportunities to explore. By my early 30s, I'd hiked most of the major trails in the Northwest and was always looking for new challenges. I worked as a software developer, which meant I could take my laptop and work remotely from my RV for weeks at a time. It was the perfect setup. Just me, my old Winnebago, and endless miles of wilderness to explore. I made friends easily on the road. There's a certain type of person you meet while traveling. Open-minded wanderers who share that same hunger for solitude and adventure. We'd cross paths at campgrounds, share meals around fires, exchange stories and trail recommendations. Some became lifelong friends like Tom Waters who, well, I'll get to that part later. By 1994, I'd developed a reputation among the RV community as someone who knew all the hidden gems, the lesser-known parks and trails where you could truly get away from it all. That's how I heard about Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois. A fellow traveler mentioned it in passing at a campground in Missouri, describing it as untouched and mysterious. Those words should have been my first warning. I'd always prided myself on being level-headed. I didn't believe in ghost stories or urban legends. The wilderness held enough real dangers without inventing supernatural ones. Bears, mountain lions, weather changes. These were the threats I prepared for. Nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in Shawnee. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed. The way the locals would grow quiet when I mentioned where I was heading. The strange warnings disguised as casual advice. Stay on the marked trails, they'd say, or make sure you're back before dark. At the time, it seemed like standard safety tips. Now I know better. That summer changed everything. It wasn't just what happened to Tom, though God knows that would have been enough. It was the way it shattered my understanding of the world. There are things out there in the dark places of the earth that defy explanation. Things that have existed long before us and will continue long after we're gone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened that night in Shawnee National Forest, you need to know how it all began. The story I'm about to tell you may seem impossible. I wouldn't blame you for doubting it. I've spent years trying to convince myself it was all a dream or hallucination. But the scars are real. The nightmares are real. And somewhere out there, that thing is still hunting. What follows is my account of those events, written down for the first time after years of therapy and countless sleepless nights. I'm sharing it now not to frighten you, but to warn you. Because if even one person reads this and decides to be more careful in the wilderness, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong, then maybe some good can come from this horror. So let me take you back to that summer of 1994, when I was still the kind of person who thought he knew all there was to know about surviving in the wild. Before I learned that some parts of the wilderness don't want to be explored. Before I discovered that sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones we're prepared for. The decision to visit Shawnee came during a particularly stressful period at work. I'd been putting in 60-hour weeks on a major software project, and the walls of my cubicle were starting to close in. When I heard about Shawnee's Garden of the Gods trail from another traveler, something clicked. Here was a place that promised solitude, challenge, and most importantly, distance from the digital world that had been consuming my life. I spent weeks researching the area, poring over topographical maps and trail guides. Shawnee was different from my usual haunts. Instead of towering peaks and alpine meadows, it offered ancient sandstone formations and dense deciduous forests. The humidity would be higher than I was used to, and the wildlife different. I adjusted my gear accordingly, adding extra water containers and lightweight, moisture-wicking clothing. The ranger station's website mentioned recent bear activity in the area, so I packed my bear spray and a new air horn. I also brought my trusty hunting knife, more for general utility than protection. I'd never needed to use it for self-defense before. Looking back, I wish I'd brought more serious protection. though I doubt it would have made a difference against what we encountered. I arrived at Shawnee on a Tuesday afternoon in late June. The air was thick with humidity, and the forest canopy created a green twilight even in mid-afternoon. I found a secluded campsite near the trailhead, backing my RV against a stand of old oaks. The spot offered a clear view of the trail while providing some privacy from other campers. Not that there were many. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Most forests have a constant background chorus of birds, insects, and small animals. Here, the quiet felt heavy, oppressive. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar environment, but something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I spent that first afternoon setting up camp and exploring the immediate area. The sandstone formations were incredible. Massive blocks of stone thrust up from the earth at impossible angles, creating natural arches and hidden caves. As the sun began to set, I noticed strange markings on some of the rocks. They looked almost like claw marks, but larger than any bear could make. It was on my second day that things started to feel wrong. I'd hiked about 3 miles from camp, following a lesser-used trail that wound between the rock formations. The air had grown noticeably cooler, despite the afternoon sun, and that unnatural silence had deepened. Then I found the first body. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The carcass had been torn apart with surgical precision, the bones stripped clean and arranged in a pattern that couldn't have been natural. No scavenger I knew worked like this. I took pictures, though my hands were shaking so badly, most came out blurred. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate further. The trail led to a narrow ravine, and as I descended, the temperature dropped even more. The rock walls were covered in more of those strange markings, deeper here and newer looking. I found scraps of fabric caught on branches. Recent camping gear, by the looks of it. The silence was absolute now. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was deadening sound. That's when I caught the first whiff of that smell, like rotting meat mixed with something chemical, something wrong. I never saw it clearly at first, just glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to move against the wind. But I could hear it, following me as I made my way back to camp. The sound of something large moving through the underbrush, but too stealthy for its size. It was near sunset when I met Tom. He was setting up camp about a quarter mile from my spot, and I was grateful for the company. We shared a fire that night, trading stories and trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. That's when we heard the first scream. It sounded almost human, but distorted, like someone trying to imitate a human voice without really understanding how it should sound. Tom grabbed his rifle. He was better prepared than me, and we scanned the darkness beyond our fire's light. The attack came from above. The creature dropped from the canopy like a shadow coming to life. In the firelight, I caught fragments of its form, impossibly long limbs, pale flesh that seemed to shift and ripple, eyes that reflected no light at all. Tom got off 2 shots before it reached him. What happened next is still a blur in my memory. I remember the sound of Tom's screams, the wet tearing noises, the smell of blood. I remember running, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the undergrowth. The creature followed. I could hear it moving through the trees above me, toying with me. I made it back to my RV somehow, fumbling with the keys as those footsteps got closer. As I peeled out of the campsite, I caught one last glimpse in my rearview mirror. A pale figure standing at the edge of the firelight, impossibly tall, with arms that hung down to the ground. The official report listed Tom's death as a bear attack. The rangers found what was left of him the next day, but by then the scene had been contaminated by scavengers. They never found the creature, of course. Never found any tracks that couldn't be explained away. The nightmares started immediately. Even now, 30 years later, I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing those not quite human screams. I've been in therapy for decades trying to process what happened. The PTSD diagnosis helps explain things to other people, gives them a framework to understand why I can't go camping anymore. why I flinch at unexpected movements in the dark. Over the years, I've collected similar stories. Not all of them end in death. Some people escape with just glimpses of something following them, or find strange arrangements of bones in the forest. The locals call it different names: Stickman, the Forest Walker, Mara. The details vary, but certain elements remain consistent. The unnatural silence, the chemical smell, the sense of being hunted. I've made contact with a few other survivors. We meet sometimes, sharing our stories in quiet bars or over secure video calls. None of us have all the answers, but we've pieced together enough to know it's real, and it's still out there. Writing this down has been difficult. Part of me still wants to rationalize what happened, to find some logical explanation that doesn't shatter my understanding of reality. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to Tom. I'm older now, and hopefully wiser. I've learned that there are places in this world that humans weren't meant to explore, corners of wilderness that should be left alone. The ancient peoples who first lived in these lands knew this. Their warnings are still there, if you know how to read them. If you're planning a trip to Shawnee or any remote wilderness, remember this. When the forest goes quiet, when you smell something chemical and wrong, when your instincts scream at you to run, listen. Don't try to be brave. Don't try to investigate. Just run. Because sometimes the monsters are real, and they're still hungry. I've always been drawn to solitude. Growing up in Boulder, Colorado, I spent countless weekends exploring the Flatirons with my father, learning to read trail markers and identify edible plants. He taught me that nature wasn't just about scenic views. It was about finding yourself in the quiet moments between footsteps. Those early experiences shaped who I became, a man more comfortable with mountain trails than city streets. By my mid-30s, I had built a comfortable life in Denver. My job as a digital marketing strategist at Thompson & Reed kept me busy during the week, but my heart belonged to the weekends. I'd become known among my colleagues as the guy who'd rather sleep in a tent than a five-star hotel. Every month, I'd take at least one weekend trip into the wilderness, and each year I planned one extended solo journey. My chance to reset and reconnect with that primal part of myself that got lost in spreadsheets and client meetings. I wasn't always alone in my adventures. Over the years, I'd built a loose network of hiking friends, people I'd met on trails or through local climbing groups. Sarah, an emergency room nurse I met during a group hike of Mount Elbert, became one of my regular climbing partners. Then there was Mike, a geology professor who could talk for hours about rock formations, and Carlos, who ran a local outdoor equipment shop and always knew the best spots for seasonal camping. But my annual solo trips were different. They were my meditation, my reset button. I'd been doing them for 7 years straight, each time pushing a little further into the wilderness, seeking that perfect balance of challenge and serenity. I'd hiked sections of the Colorado Trail, camped in the Maroon Bells Snowmass Wilderness, and spent a week in the Roosevelt National Forest. Each trip left me feeling more centered, more alive. That's why, when I started planning my 2003 trip, I was drawn to the San Juan National Forest. It was one of the few major Colorado wilderness areas I hadn't explored extensively, and something about its remoteness called to me. The San Juans had a reputation for being less tourist-heavy than other Colorado mountain ranges, with vast stretches of pristine wilderness that remained relatively untouched. Perfect for someone seeking solitude. I remember sitting in my apartment in Denver's Capitol Hill neighborhood, spreading maps across my coffee table, tracing potential routes with my finger. The San Juans offered everything I was looking for: challenging terrain, diverse ecosystems, and most importantly, that sense of genuine wilderness that was becoming harder to find in more popular areas. My Uncle Tom's old Winnebago sat in my building's parking lot, a faithful companion for my adventures since he'd passed away 3 years prior. It wasn't much to look at. The 1992 model had seen better days, with its faded striping and slightly rusty bumper. But it was reliable and felt like home. I'd maintained it meticulously, knowing that in the backcountry, vehicle failure wasn't just an inconvenience, it could be dangerous. The weeks leading up to my departure were filled with careful preparation. I updated my first aid kit, replaced my hiking boots' worn laces, and spent hours researching the specific challenges of the San Juan region. Carlos helped me select some new gear from his shop, including a better sleeping bag rated for the lower temperatures I might encounter at higher elevations. Sarah insisted on reviewing my emergency protocols and making sure I had a properly stocked medical kit. What none of us could have known was that this trip would be different from all the others. That the San Juan National Forest held secrets darker than any of us could have imagined. That the skills I'd spent years honing wouldn't prepare me for what I was about to encounter. And that after August 17, 2003, I would never look at the wilderness or myself the same way again. The morning I left Denver was perfect for driving. Clear skies, mild temperatures, and that distinctive Colorado crispness in the air that makes you feel alive. I had loaded the Winnebago the night before. 2 weeks' worth of supplies, detailed topographical maps, my trusted hiking gear, and enough emergency equipment to handle almost any situation. Almost. The drive south was peaceful, watching the familiar Front Range landscape gradually transform into the more rugged terrain of southern Colorado. I took Highway 285 south, then cut west on Highway 50, each mile taking me further from the comfortable predictability of city life. The San Juan Mountains rose before me like ancient guardians, their peaks still holding patches of snow even in August. I had chosen a relatively remote area in the eastern part of the forest, away from the popular hiking trails and tourist spots. The location I'd selected was near a small stream that wasn't even named on most maps, but satellite imagery showed a clearing large enough for the RV and promising access to several hiking trails. The Forest Service road leading to my chosen spot was rougher than expected. The Winnebago groaned as I carefully navigated around potholes and over rocks, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the trees. The air grew noticeably cooler as I climbed in elevation, and the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing denser and taller. When I finally reached the clearing, it was better than I had hoped. The small stream I'd seen on the maps burbled cheerfully nearby, and the clearing was level enough for comfortable camping. Surrounded by towering pines and spruce trees, with mountains visible through gaps in the canopy, it felt like my own private paradise. I spent the remaining daylight setting up camp, following the routine I'd developed over years of similar trips. The Winnebago was positioned for easy exit if needed, my camping chair placed to catch both morning and evening sun, and my hiking gear organized for easy access. As darkness fell, I sat outside with a cup of hot chocolate, listening to the stream and watching the stars emerge in the impossibly clear mountain sky. That first night was peaceful, but looking back there were signs I should have noticed. The absence of certain night sounds, the usual hooting of owls or chirping of crickets, the way the air seemed to grow unusually still just after midnight. But I was too content, too comfortable in my expertise and experience to recognize these subtle warnings. The next 2 days followed my planned routine. I took day hikes to explore the surrounding area, marking potential routes on my map and noting interesting features. The terrain was challenging but beautiful, with unexpected meadows full of wildflowers breaking up the dense forest, and rock formations that would have made Mike, my geologist friend, ecstatic. I encountered few signs of human presence, the occasional old campfire ring or worn trail marker, which only reinforced my satisfaction with the location's remoteness. The wildlife seemed abundant but shy. Deer tracks near the stream, eagle shadows passing overhead, and once, what I thought was a bear's marking on a tree. It wasn't until the third day that I ventured further from camp than before, following what appeared to be a game trail that led up into higher elevation. The path wound through increasingly dense forest, the trees growing closer together and the underbrush becoming thicker. The air felt different here, heavier somehow, with an unfamiliar scent that I couldn't quite place. That was when I found the first strange sign, though I didn't recognize its significance at the time. It was a tree, larger than the others, with deep gouges in its bark. Not unusual in itself, bears often mark trees, but these marks were different. They were too high, too systematic, and they formed a pattern that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I took a photo, thinking it might make an interesting conversation piece back home. If only I had known then what that mark meant. If only I had recognized it as the warning it was. But I was still operating under the assumptions of my old world. A world where the strangest thing you might encounter in the wilderness was a lost hiker or an unusually bold coyote. I had no framework for understanding what I was about to encounter, no reference point for the terror that awaited me in the depths of the San Juan forest. The change happened gradually, like storm clouds gathering on a sunny day. It started with small things, subtle shifts in the forest's atmosphere that I might not have noticed if I hadn't spent so much years in the wilderness. The birds stopped singing first, their absence creating a void that seemed to swallow the natural sounds of the forest. Then came the smell, an odd, musty odor that reminded me of wet rot and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. On the fourth day, I decided to explore a narrow valley I had spotted from a higher vantage point. The trail was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path, winding between ancient trees that seemed to lean inward, their branches creating a natural tunnel. The further I went, the more the light changed, filtering through the canopy in strange ways that made ordinary objects appear distorted. That's when I found the first real evidence that something was wrong. Hidden behind a fallen log, partially covered by leaves and forest debris, was a backpack. Not unusual in itself, hikers sometimes lost equipment, but this one was torn. Not in the way that comes from normal wear and tear, but in long, deliberate strips. The contents were scattered nearby. A crushed water bottle, shredded clothing, a journal with pages ripped out and scattered. The most disturbing part was the dark stains that covered much of the material, stains that looked uncomfortably like dried blood. I should have turned back then. Every instinct honed through years of outdoor experience was screaming at me to return to the safety of my campsite. But curiosity, that deadly human trait that has led so many to their doom, pushed me forward. I told myself I needed to investigate, that someone might need help, that I had a responsibility to report what I'd found. The valley narrowed as I proceeded, the walls rising steep and forbidding on either side. The temperature dropped noticeably, despite it being mid-afternoon on a summer day. The strange smell grew stronger, and with it came a sensation I'd never experienced before. A feeling of being watched that was so intense it made my skin crawl. Then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in any forest I knew. It started as a low rumble, almost below the threshold of hearing, but it grew into something that resembled breathing. If breathing could somehow carry malice. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the valley with its ominous presence. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over that terrible sound. Years of outdoor experience had taught me how to react to various wildlife encounters. Make yourself big for bears, back away slowly from mountain lions, but nothing had prepared me for this. This was something different, something wrong. Movement caught my eye, a shadow where no shadow should be, moving in a way that defied natural law. It was large, much larger than any animal I knew inhabited these mountains. But it was the way it moved that turned my blood to ice, fluid yet angular, like something trying to mimic natural movement but not quite succeeding. I raised my camera with trembling hands, more from instinct than conscious thought. The autofocus struggled to lock onto the shape, as if it couldn't quite process what it was seeing. But I managed to take one photo before the thing moved again. Looking at that image later, I would question my sanity, but in that moment, I knew with terrible certainty that what I was seeing was real. The creature, and I use that word for lack of a better term, was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every possible way. Its limbs were too long, too jointed. its skin a mottled gray that seemed to shift and change like shadows on water. But it was the face that haunted my nightmares for years to come. A face that seemed to be composed of darkness itself, with eyes that reflected no light, no soul, no trace of anything I could recognize as living. What happened next is both crystal clear in my memory and somehow fragmented, like a broken mirror reflecting different pieces of the same terrible image. I remember running, the sound of my own desperate breathing mixing with that other horrible sound that seemed to be getting closer. I remember branches whipping past my face, roots trying to trip my feet, the forest itself seeming to conspire against my escape. But most of all, I remember the feeling of being hunted, not just pursued, but hunted by something that was playing with me, something that could have caught me at any moment, but was choosing to let me run. The realization that I was being toyed with was almost worse than the fear of the thing itself. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmare chase. But eventually, I burst out of the valley and into more open forest, the late afternoon sun cutting through the trees in sharp beams that seemed to push back the shadows. The breathing sound faded, and with it, that sense of malevolent presence. I didn't stop running until I reached my campsite, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. The Winnebago sat there exactly as I'd left it, looking absurdly normal in the fading daylight. But nothing felt normal anymore. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just hours before now loomed threatening and alien. As I fumbled with the RV's door, trying to get inside to safety, I heard something that made me freeze. A human voice, calling for help from the direction I'd just come. It sounded desperate, authentic, and for a moment I was torn between my instinct for self-preservation and my duty to help someone in trouble. That's when I remembered the backpack I'd found, and a horrible realization dawned on me. Whatever that thing was, it had learned to hunt humans, and it had learned to use our own humanity against us. I had just locked myself inside the Winnebago when I heard it again. That voice calling for help, closer now, more desperate. But there was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl. The words were right, but the cadence was off, like someone, or something, trying to mimic human speech without fully understanding it. The sun was setting rapidly, the forest outside growing darker by the minute. I had always loved this time of day in the wilderness, when the world transformed from one state to another. But now, each lengthening shadow seemed to hide potential horrors, and the gathering darkness felt alive with malicious intent. I tried to call for help on my satellite phone, but the signal was dead. Not weak, not intermittent, but completely dead, as if something was blocking it. The radio I'd brought as a backup produced nothing but static, punctuated by what sounded like that same wrong breathing I'd heard in the valley. The temperature inside the RV dropped suddenly, dramatically, my breath forming clouds in the air. The windows began to fog up, and I realized with growing horror that the condensation was forming on the inside of the glass, creating patterns that looked disturbingly like handprints. That's when I heard it. A scratching sound on the roof of the Winnebago, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging their nails across the metal. The sound moved from one end to the other, then back again, testing, searching. The entire RV creaked under weight that shouldn't have been there, weight that shifted in ways that defied physical laws. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, my hand clamped over my mouth to prevent any sound from escaping. The scratching continued, accompanied now by that breathing sound, closer than ever. It seemed to be coming from directly above me, as if the thing was lying on the roof, its face right above my head, separated from me by only a thin layer of metal and insulation. The windows were completely fogged now, but through the condensation, I could see shapes moving outside. Shadows that were darker than the darkness itself, flowing around the RV like liquid night. The voice came again, but this time it was different. It was my voice, calling for help, using words I had spoken earlier that day. The thing on the roof shifted, and suddenly there was a face at the window, or what passed for a face. It was pressed against the glass, its features distorting as if they were made of smoke and shadow rather than flesh and bone. The eyes were the worst part. Deep, endless pits that seemed to draw in light rather than reflect it. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, my throat was raw, and the thing was gone. The temperature began to rise, the condensation on the windows starting to dissipate. But I could still hear it out there, moving around the RV, testing, waiting. I spent that night in a state of perpetual terror, huddled in the back of the Winnebago with my back against the wall, clutching the only weapon I had, a hunting knife that seemed pathetically inadequate against whatever was out there. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper of wind became a potential harbinger of horror. As the night wore on, the attacks became more frequent, more aggressive. The thing seemed to be growing frustrated with my refusal to come out, to play its game. It began to rock the RV, slowly at first, then with increasing violence. The metal groaned under the assault, and I feared the whole vehicle would tip over. But the physical attacks weren't the worst part. It was the psychological warfare that truly tested my sanity. The thing began to speak again, but now it was using the voices of people I knew. My father, Sarah, Mike, Carlos. Each voice called out to me, begging for help, screaming in pain, accusing me of abandoning them. I had to constantly remind myself that these people were safe at home. Dawn came with agonizing slowness. As the first gray light filtered through the fog-streaked windows, the attacks gradually subsided. The oppressive presence that had dominated the night began to recede, like a tide pulling back from the shore. But I knew better than to feel relief. Something told me this wasn't over. I used those precious morning hours to prepare. My hands shook as I gathered what I could use as weapons: the hunting knife, a flare gun from my emergency kit, a heavy flashlight. I also packed a small bag with water, energy bars, and basic first aid supplies. If I had to run, I wanted to be ready. Around mid-morning, I heard something new. An actual human voice calling out. Not the mimicry from the night before, but a genuine cry for help. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I peered out the window. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of someone stumbling through the forest. It was a man, his clothes torn and dirty, moving with the desperate energy of someone being pursued. That's when I met Jake. I still don't know if saving him was the right thing to do, but I couldn't leave another human being out there with that thing. I started the RV and drove toward him, my heart pounding with each turn of the wheels. When I pulled alongside him, the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He'd seen it too. Jake's story tumbled out between gasps for breath. He'd been camping with 3 friends about 5 miles deeper into the forest. They'd been attacked in the night. Something moving through their camp like a living shadow. His friends? He'd seen things happen to them that he could barely describe through his tears. Things that defied natural law and human comprehension. We needed to get out, to warn someone, to do something. But the forest had other plans. As I tried to turn the RV around, the engine suddenly died. No amount of turning the key would bring it back to life. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Jake's quiet whimpers and that familiar, terrible breathing sound that seemed to be getting closer. What followed was a desperate race through the forest on foot. We abandoned most of our supplies, taking only what we could carry in our small packs. The terrain that had seemed challenging but manageable days before now became an obstacle course from hell. Every fallen log could hide that creature. Every shadow could come alive with malevolent purpose. Jake was faster than me, his fear giving him almost superhuman energy. But I had more wilderness experience, and I knew that running blindly through the forest was as dangerous as whatever was pursuing us. We needed a plan, a destination. According to my maps, there was a ranger station about 7 miles away. If we could reach it, the thing toyed with us as we fled. Sometimes it would seem to be right behind us, that wet breathing sound close enough to feel on our necks. Other times it would appear ahead, a dark shape blocking our path, forcing us to change direction. It was hurting us, I realized with growing horror, driving us deeper into its territory. The physical toll of our flight was immense, but the psychological impact was far worse. The creature had a way of getting inside your head, making you doubt everything, your senses, your sanity, even your own existence. Time became meaningless. Had we been running for hours or days? The forest seemed to go on forever, each tree identical to the last, each path leading us in circles. It ended near a cliff edge as the sun was setting. We'd been driven there deliberately, I realized too late. The drop was at least 60 feet to a rocky stream bed below. The forest behind us had gone completely silent, that unnatural stillness that I'd come to associate with the creature's presence. Jake saw it first. His scream was cut short as the thing emerged from the shadows. In the fading daylight, I finally got a clear look at what had been hunting us. My mind still struggles to process what I saw. The creature stood at least 9 feet tall, its form constantly shifting between solid and shadow. Those empty eyes fixed on us with ancient, alien intelligence. What happened next is a blur in my memory. I remember Jake trying to run, but there was nowhere to go. I remember the creature moving with impossible speed. I remember the flare gun in my hand, the red light brilliant against the gathering darkness. I remember falling, the sensation of empty air beneath me. Then pain. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Durango. I'd survived the fall from the cliff, though barely. Multiple broken bones, internal injuries, severe concussion. Jake wasn't as fortunate. They found his body 2 days later, or what was left of it. The official report blamed a bear attack, but I knew better. The marks on his body didn't match any known predator. The authorities searched the area but found nothing unusual. The ranger station had no record of any other disappearances or strange occurrences. My RV was eventually found, completely normal except for deep scratches on the roof that no one could explain. The photos from my camera were all corrupted except for one, a blurry image that experts dismissed as a camera malfunction or double exposure. It's been 20 years since that August in the San Juans. I've never gone back to that forest, never gone camping alone again. The physical scars have healed, but the others, the ones that run deeper, never will. I still wake up sometimes hearing that wet breathing sound, still see those empty eyes in the darkness of my room. I've spent years researching, trying to understand what I encountered. I've found stories, whispered accounts from other survivors, ancient legends from Native American tribes, historical records of disappearances in that region going back centuries. Some call it a Wendigo, others have different names for it. I don't think names matter. What matters is that it's still out there. I'm sharing this story now because people need to know. The wilderness isn't just about beautiful views and peaceful solitude. There are dark things in this world, ancient things that lurk in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. Things that wear darkness like a skin and feed on human terror as much as flesh. I still love the mountains, still feel their call. But I know now that there are places we shouldn't go, paths we shouldn't follow. The true horror isn't just what happened to me in those woods. It's knowing that somewhere in the San Juan National Forest, in a valley that doesn't appear on any map, something is waiting. Waiting and watching. Ready to remind us that we are not the apex predators we believe ourselves to be. If you're planning a trip to the San Juans, stick to the marked trails. Don't go alone. And if you're deep in the forest and the birds stop singing, if you smell something like wet rot and copper, if you hear a voice calling for help that sounds almost, but not quite, human, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. And pray it hasn't already caught your scent.